Bună seara, dragi prieteni! Mă bucur să vă am din nou ca oaspeți pe pagina mea de Facebook. Am fost plecat vreme de 2 săptămâni, am bătut drumurile României și de asemenea și Ucraina, unde m-am întâlnit cu mulți dintre dumneavoastră. Vreau să vă mulțumesc înainte de a începe discuția din seara aceasta pentru ospitalitate cu care m-ați primit peste tot în România și mă bucur să ne putem vedea din nou în direct pe pagina mea de Facebook. În seara aceasta vom discuta un subiect foarte important, un subiect privind extremismul politic. După cum știți, anul trecut am început să fac live-uri pe pagina mea de Facebook privind comunismul, care este o formă a extremismului politic. Am avut o discuție cu cineva din Statele Unite, un profesor din California, privind comunismul în China. De asemenea, am dorit să am un live cu cineva din România pe tema extremismului politic din România, în mod special al comunismului, dar până acum nu am găsit o persoană binevoitoare pentru un astfel de live, dar sper să îl putem face cât de curând, sperând să aflu pe cineva cu care să discut acest subiect. Deci, în seara aceasta voi discuta un subiect inedit, voi discuta subiectul extremismului politic în America Latină. Cei care sunteți interesați sau au studiat cât de cât istoria Americii Latine, ați observat că în America Latină, în ultimii 200-300 de ani, fenomenul extremismului politic a fost deosebit de pronunțat. Iar din acest capitol sau istorie uriașă a Americii Latine și extremismul politic în America Latină, am ales în seara aceasta să discut subiectul unei mișcări cu adevărat neobișnuite, chiar stranii, aș spune eu, care în timp de 12 ani a cauzat aproape 70.000 de victime, persoane ucise în Peru. Peru este o țară relativ la fel ca și România, cu o populație de aproximativ 20-22 de milioane de oameni și vă imaginați că 70.000 de persoane fiind ucise de teroriști într-o perioadă de aproximativ 12 ani este totuși un fenomen care trebuie să ne alarmeze. Natural, în România comunismul a distrus aproximativ 800.000 de oameni, dar este important să ne amintim din când în când că extremismul politic este o problemă peste tot în lume, în Europa și în alte țări. Deci vedem și în ziua de astăzi extremismul politic fiind în acțiune în Ucraina, un subiect care sper să-l discut cu altcineva în câteva săptămâni. Deci în seara aceasta vom discuta extremismul politic în America Latină, luând ca exemplu Peru și mișcarea teroristă maoistă cu numele de Shining Path, adică Calea Luminoasă, sau în limba spaniolă mișcarea aceasta se numește Sendero Luminoso. Voi discuta subiectul acesta cu profesorul Miguel la Serna de la Universitatea din Carolina în Chapel Hill. Deci subiectul din seara aceasta îl voi discuta în limba engleză cu oaspetele meu și așa cum sunteți obișnuiți, voi face o mică prezentare în limba română a oaspetelui meu, iar după aceea voi permite oaspetelui meu să își facă o prezentare proprie în limba engleză și voi trece din limba română în limba engleză și voi face un rezumat din când în când a ideilor principale ale subiectului din seara aceasta. Deci acum voi schimba discursul meu în limba engleză. Professor la Serna, hello to you in North Carolina.
Hello, thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
I thank you very much, Professor la Serna, as we spoke for about 10-15 minutes before we actually went live. I'm really honored to have you with me tonight on my Facebook page. I'm really humbled actually, knowing that I have a guest on my Facebook page, a person of such great knowledge about the subject that we are going to discuss tonight. And what I would like to do is I'd like to ask you to make a presentation about yourself, to present yourself and your background, maybe your place of origin, and how you sort of got to this point in your academic life, and then we'll get into the subject which we have selected to discuss tonight.
Happy to do so. So I'm originally from California in the United States. I was born and raised in Sacramento, California, but my family is Peruvian on my father's side. And so we always had connections to my Peruvian side of the family. I really grew up in the 1980s and in the 1990s, visiting frequently to Peru at the height of the insurgency and political violence there. So it was something that I was familiar with, but familiar with as a kind of frequent visitor. And it was something that was, of course, very different to me because I, was growing up in California in the 80s and 90s, which had its own set of problems and issues, but certainly did not have an armed internal conflict like was happening in Peru. So things like power outages, car bombs, tanks in the streets were things that became some of my earliest memories in life. I ended up going to college at the University of California, Davis, and I majored in Latin American history and Spanish. And then I ended up going to the University of California at San Diego for graduate school, where I started studying the origins of the Shining Path insurgency in Ayacucho, which was the place where the Shining Path ended up starting its war and where most of the violence took place. And so this was kind of a trajectory for me that was both professional and personal.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor. I'm going to switch now to Romanian to make a brief presentation of your background in Romanian, and then I will come back. And I would like to start our conversation when I come back and revert to English and discuss a little bit the subject of political extremism, which concerns a lot of, I would say, wise people around the world, educated people. We are seeing what's happening in the Ukraine right now, which I believe is a form of political extremism, but that's a different story. And so I'd like, when we come back, to talk about briefly about this phenomenon of political extremism. How real is it around the globe, maybe in the United States, even in Europe, and whether or not we should be concerned about it. And then we'll take the Shining Path as an example of what I believe to be a form of political extremism. So let me switch to Romanian, and I'll be back in about 2 or 3 minutes back to you in English. Dragi prieteni, domnul care a agreat să fie cu mine pe pagina mea de Facebook acum seara, profesorul la Serna, este născut în Statele Unite, în California. Părinții dânsului sunt peruvieni, imigranți din Peru. Dânsul a făcut școala la universități prestigioase din California, Universitatea din California în localitatea Davis, unde a studiat istoria Americii Latine. De asemenea, a studiat la Universitatea din California în orașul San Diego, care este în sudul Californiei, unde a devenit interesat în fenomenul extremismului politic în America Latină. A călătorit foarte mult prin Peru, având în vedere că familia lui provine din Peru, fiind fiu de imigranți. În Peru a călătorit mult, a studiat și în Peru și a devenit interesat în, cum spuneam, în această mișcare extremistă, neobișnuită, despre care vom discuta acum seara, care este Shining Path sau în limba română Calea Luminoasă, o mișcare teroristă comunistă care și-a făcut amprenta în America Latină, dar mai ales în Peru între anii 1980 și anul 1992. Profesorul de la Serna este la ora actuală profesor de științe sau de studii latinoamericane la Universitatea din Carolina de Nord. Dânsul este autorul a mai multor cărți, printre care și cartea aceasta, care se numește The Shining Path, Love, Madness and Revolution in the Andes. Calea Luminoasă, o poveste de dragoste, nebunie și revoluție în Munții Anzi din America Latină. Primul subiect care o să-l discut cu domnul profesor în seara aceasta este fenomenul extremismului politic, cât de serios este el la ora actuală în lume, în Europa, în America, ca și o introducere la subiectul care voi discuta în seara aceasta, și anume exemplu specific privind terorismul extremist în Peru. So, Professor La Serna, let's talk about this phenomenon of political extremism. As I mentioned a short while ago, tell us about what's going on in the world in the last couple of years, maybe the last decade or so. It seems that we are facing a resurgence of some sort of a political extremism.
Yeah, I think political extremism has always been with us, and it's something that is, we've had from anarchist movements in the early 20th century to the Cold War extremism that we have seen on both the left and the right. And I think now we're in a moment of political extremism that really concerns me, and that's with the sort of kind of ethno-nationalism and white nationalism that we're starting to see. Certainly in the United States, I think we're seeing a rise of political extremism on the far right, which is kind of a response to, I think, a changing demographic of the country of the United States. It's also a response to globalization and neoliberalism and their impact. And so I think we're starting to see in different countries some extremist groups that are starting to kind of really turn to a kind of hyper nationalism that is starting to manifest itself in different dangerous ways. And this is something that that definitely gives me cause for concern as somebody who studies this.
I did a book review. I read a book about 2 or 3 years ago. The name of the book is Age of Anger. I forgot the name of the author. Maybe you have read it, maybe you have not. Have you read that book?
No, not read it.
Yeah, it was written by a British scholar of Indian descent, and it really opened up my eyes to this worldwide phenomenon. People are angry all over the world, just like you said, for various reasons. Talk about demographic change in the United States, ethno-nationalism, and let me go ahead and switch back to Romanian and again make a brief summary of your comments. And when we come back, I would like for us to get into the subject. And what I would like to do is to ask you to give us a background to the shining path, the political economic situation in Peru back in the 60s and 70s, which I think is intertwined with Abimael Guzman and The Shining Path and so on and so forth. Deci l-am întrebat pe invitatul meu să ne spună câteva cuvinte despre extremismul politic. Dânsul agrează cu mine. În ultimii ani, 10 ani, observăm în toată lumea o relansare a extremismului politic. Dânsul spunea și eu agreez. Extremismul politic a fost parte din istoria umanității vreme de mii de ani. Și din nefericire vedem o reînvigorare, se pare, a acestui extremism în ziua de astăzi. Unul dintre extremismele politice ale zilei pe care dânsul l-a menționat a fost așa numitul ethno-nationalism, naționalismul bazat pe etnie. Și cum spuneam mai devreme, conflictul din Ucraina pare să fie într-o oarecare măsură ambiția domnului Putin de a reconstitui Uniunea Sovietică sau Imperiul Țarist în vechile frontiere ale Imperiului Țarist înainte de prăbușirea lui pe la anul 1990. A doua întrebare care o să am pentru domnul profesor în seara aceasta este să descrie situația economică și socială din Peru în anii 60 și 70 care a dus la formarea și lansarea acestui grup terorist maoist comunist Calea Luminoasă. So Professor Serna, go ahead and let's see what you can tell us about the background to this story in the 60s and the 70s in Peru.
Peru in the 1960s and 70s was a country with tremendous disparities of wealth and resource distribution. It was a country where the minority population of indigenous Quechua speakers, who had ranged to be up to a quarter of the population at different times in history, but they were the ones who kind of had been the most historically marginalized and exploited, particularly in the Andes. And so it was a situation where in Peru you would have indigenous people who were also peasants, indigenous peasants, who tended to be the ones who were landless. They did not possess the land that they worked on. They worked as serfs, essentially, for large kind of landowners. And so it was a situation that there had been movement actually to address this throughout Peruvian history and Latin American history. And we start to see kind of mobilizations for land more than anything in the 1960s. With people like Hugo Blanco, who are leading these kind of campesino or peasant mobilizations, land invasions, to try to recover some lands that people in the Andes, particularly Quechua-speaking peasants, believed that had actually rightfully so, had been taken from them really since the conquest and even colonialism. And so this is kind of the backdrop in Peru, but there's a military government that takes power in 1968. And unlike basically every other Latin American military regime, this one actually leans politically to the left. And Juan Velasco Alvarado is the head of this military coup that takes power in 1968, and he immediately institutes the next year a sweeping agrarian reform to try to address some of these issues, and he carries out several other social reforms designed to try to address some of these grievances that had been really bubbling up for some time. But this is kind of the backdrop of what's happening in Peru, but at the same time you see mobilization on the left, where you have people, university educated people who tend to be children of peasants. They tend to be kind of more urban, more mestizo, more white even, and they're also starting to engage in revolutionary, kind of armed revolutionary activities. We see different kind of guerrilla groups emerging in the 1960s. Not just in Peru, but throughout Latin America after the Cuban Revolution becomes successful. And so there's different efforts to kind of take the armed revolutionary path to address some of the grievances too. So these two things are kind of like in the background when the Shining Path arises, and the Shining Path arises as sort of taking on a more Maoist, well, actually a definitively Maoist approach to protracted People's War and communist revolution, and so in doing so, it rejects the proposals and the initiatives and the agendas of the military regime, denouncing the regime as fascist and as actually not doing the kind of revolutionary work that only an armed revolution should do. So these kind of historical factors all came to a head with the formation of Shining Path in 1969.
Thank you very much. Comentariile dânsului parcă mă amintesc de situația din România, în special a țăranului român în secolul XIX. În anii 60 și 70 ai veacului trecut, dânsul ne explica situația populației autohtone din Peru, incașii, dar și de asemenea populația de o rasă mixtă, mestizo, cum spune dânsul, erau deposedați, adică nu aveau pământul era concentrat în mâinile marilor latifundiari încă în anii 60 și 70 ai veacului trecut. Parcă ne amintim, cum spuneam, de situația țăranilor români din veacul XIX în Ardeal, în țara românească, în Moldova, care nu aveau pământ, și dânsul a folosit o expresie care mi-a atras atenția. Încă în anii 60 și 70 țăranii sau incașii din Peru parcă avea statutul unor iobagi. După cum știți, în România nu am avut sclavi, nu au fost sclavie, dar în România am avut iobagi. Părinții noștri, străbunii noștri, acum 200 de ani, 250 de ani, erau un fel de iobagi, adică nu puteau să se miște, să se mute dintr-o parte într-alta, locuiau pe proprietatea marilor latifundiari, grofi, boieri, și în momentul în care un grof vindea proprietatea, pământul unui alt grof, părinții noștri, ființele umane, erau transferate de sub autoritatea unui grof sub autoritatea altui grof. Deci situația era similară în Peru în anii 60 și 70 și natural, după cum știm din istorie, în momentul în care aceste disparități în avere de natură economică, de natură socială devin acute, natural oamenii încep să gândească în mod extremist și încep să recurgă la anumite măsuri tot mai radicale pentru a dobândi libertate, pentru a dobândi o bucată de pământ și așa mai departe. Un alt lucru care s-a întâmplat în anii 60 și 70 în Peru a fost faptul că unii dintre fii și fiicele acestor țărani și mestizos, săraci, incași, au devenit educați, au ajuns să facă studii universitare și au început să mobilizeze oamenii, grupuri de oameni care au început să atace aici și acolo instituțiile de stat și chiar au început să lanseze anumite acțiuni teroriste. De asemenea, ne amintește și de revoluția comunistă din Cuba, din finalul anilor 50, care a avut un eco de asemenea în America Latină și în Peru. E vorba de mișcarea lui Castro în Cuba și acestea au fost realitățile sau contextul economic, politic, social în care această mișcare teroristă cu numele de Shining Path sau Calea Luminoasă, Sendero Luminoso, a apărut în Peru prin anii 60 și 70. Acum, următorul aspect al discuției mele cu domnul profesor va fi să discutăm persoana care a fost vreme de 10 de ani în capul, vârful de lance al acestei mișcări, conducătorul acestei mișcări. Persoana respectivă se numește Abimael Guzman. Vom discuta despre viața dânsului, trecutul dânsului, educația dânsului și după aceea vom discuta în modul în care această organizație a terorizat pur și simplu Peru vreme de 2 decenii. So going back to you, Professor Serna, let's talk about the man, of course, that whose name is associated with the Shining Path, and that is Abimael Guzman. Tell us about this man, his background, social origin, education, profession. How did he end up, adopting the Maoist version or style, if you will, of Marxist-Leninism? What were his relations with the Soviet Union, Cuba? I know it's a broad story, but tell us about the man, his education, his background.
Abimael Guzman was the white son of basically the sort of overseer or administrator of an hacienda, and his mother was somebody who was not the wife of this man, and so his mother ended up trying to raise Guzman by herself, but then she, of course, for reasons that for economic interest, she wasn't able to raise her son by herself and also kind of look for work, and so she ended up sending him to go live with his uncle in Callao, which is a twin city of Lima on the coast. He was originally from the region of Arequipa in southern Peru. He stayed there, went to school there. So he actually went to school in coastal high schools. And then he ended up moving back in with his father in Arequipa to kind of finish high school. And he ended up going to college at the University of San Agustin in Arequipa. And so there, Guzman engaged in some radical politics. He began to really align himself with communism. He was at the university when Stalin died in 1953. And this was a time where it was now kind of, people were starting to realize some of the atrocities that were being done under Stalinism, and kind of demystifying and de-Stalinizing was taking place in the Soviet Union. But Guzman was somebody who had a kind of distant admiration or restrained admiration for Stalin. He defended Stalin even after his death at a time where it wasn't as popular to do so anymore. But he, of course, recognized that Stalin had many, many flaws, and he certainly didn't make apologies for those. But by the time he ends up graduating with dual degrees in law and philosophy from the university in Arequipa, Guzman takes a job teaching philosophy at a relatively recently reopened university in Ayacucho. And this is the University of San Cristóbal de Huamanga. And he moves there in 1962. And this is a place, again, as we were just talking about, with the kind of disparities and discrepancies with the mestizo and indigenous social and racial categories, that was very pronounced in Ayacucho. It's a place of mostly Quechua-speaking peasants in a lot of the rural areas, and even in the city, there tend to be peasant market women, children of peasants going to school, many of them for the first time ever. And so he was a professor there, and he was already a Marxist and a communist when he arrived at Ayacucho. And he took a couple of really pivotal for him trips to Mao's China during the height of the Cultural Revolution. And these trips had a profound impact on him. He realized at this time, he drew the conclusion that a Maoist peasant war was the really only way to liberate Peru from the kind of shackles of really semi-feudalism, is how he called it, or semi-colonialism. And so he thought that this was the way to go in Peru too, with such a kind of prominent peasant, landless peasantry. Even despite the fact that there was a major land reform that would end up coming later that decade. But he ended up becoming a professor and using the university as a breeding ground for his kind of Maoist views and for the idea of recruiting an army for a Maoist insurgency. And he recruited primarily from other faculty at the university. It was very common in the early to mid 1960s to be for leftists to believe in armed revolution. It was something that was happening around the world, and it was certainly something that people were talking about in Peru, and some people were actually putting into action. So that wasn't so strange at the time to be talking about armed revolution, or even to be talking about a Maoist one. But Guzman quickly kind of started to control much of the very extreme left and the more hardline Maoist path within the university circle. He recruited other school teachers who went out to local villages and taught there. And then he brought in a lot of students at the university who, again, many of them were first generation college students, children of Quechua-speaking farmers, but also recruiting students who went to high school, where some of the teachers who were part of this organization actually went. And so by the late 1960s, the group that Guzman is in charge of ends up splintering off a couple of times from the main kind of Soviet aligned Communist Party, and they formed their own Maoist splinter. And in 1969 and into early 1970, that ends up becoming the splinter that is known today as the Shining Path, which is short for the Peruvian Communist Party Shining Path. And Guzman and the Shining Path believed that the Shining Path was the only true and legitimate Peruvian Communist Party. So they did not see themselves any longer as a splinter. They saw themselves as the only true legitimate Communist Party in Peru.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Let me go ahead and switch back to Romanian and make a brief summary of your comments. And by the way, people are beginning to comment. They appreciate your presence on my Facebook page tonight. They're saying good evening to you. They actually are saying buena seara, which means buenas tardes in Spanish. Bueno, buna. So I don't speak Spanish, just a little bit, but we talked before we went on the air. We talked about Romanian and Spanish being similar because they come from the same historical background and linguistic tree, if you will. Deci l-am întrebat pe domnul profesor să ne spună câteva cuvinte despre trecutul acestui om atât de crud și atât de care s-a comportat într-un mod atât de inuman, și am vrut să știm câteva detalii privind viața dânsului, privind experiențele dânsului de viață, privind ideologia și privind educația lui. By the way, Professor La Serna, when was he born? So we'll put this in context.
He was 26 when he arrived in 1962.
So that was, he was born in 1936 or so, right?
Yeah, right around then.
Okay. Deci, din câte înțelegem, acest terorist, domn Guzman, s-a născut pe la anul 1936, s-a născut într-o familie destul de săracă. Tatăl era, de fapt, fiul ilegitim dintr-o familie unde tatăl lui era administratorul unei hacienda, a unei ferme uriașe în Peru, și mama l-a crescut pentru o vreme singură, dar având în vedere că condițiile de viață erau extrem de dificile, l-a dat pe acest tinerel, Abimael, așa cum l-a numit, natural o apelație, un nume din Biblie, l-a dat să fie crescut de unchiul lui, și unchiul lui s-a ocupat într-adevăr de educația lui Guzman, a lui Abimael, și a făcut studii universitare în orașul Arequipa din sudul țării acesteia, Peru, Apropo, fac o mică paranteză, am fost în Ayacucho o dată sau de 2 ori în anii când eram mai tânăr în viață. Vă recomand fiecăruia dintre voi, dragii mei, dacă ajungeți în Peru sau chiar dacă nu aveți dorință să vizitați Peru, să mergeți în Peru. Este o țară fascinantă. Arequipa este un oraș colonial cu o istorie extraordinară, catedrale extraordinare, mănăstiri și așa mai departe, care dovedesc prezența multiseculară a creștinismului și a catolicismului în America de Sud. Deci acest terorist a studiat în Arequipa, a studiat filozofia și a studiat dreptul, iar după aceea s-a mutat în anul 1962 în orașul Ayacucho, unde a devenit profesor universitar la Universitatea din Ayacucho. În anii 50, în anul 1953, Stalin a murit, la perioada aceea de timp când Guzman avea aproximativ 20 de ani sau cam așa ceva. Era un suporter al lui Stalin. Îi plăcea ceea ce Stalin făcuse în Uniunea Sovietică, cruzimea lui Stalin, și a ajuns la concluzia că forța este extrem de importantă pentru a aduce progres în societate, adică distrugerea individului, voința și libertatea individului și instaurarea unei dictaturi care să ducă la succes și progres economic și social. Deci așa el a devenit radicalizat în anii 60, s-a dus în China, a vizitat China în anii 60. În China era încă sub autoritatea lui Mao și a fost impresionat de acțiunile lui Mao de a transforma țăranii din China în forța motrice, dacă vreți, a societății chineze, transformarea economică, culturală, politică, socială a Chinei prin folosirea clasei țăranilor. La întoarcerea în Peru, Guzman a devenit foarte interesat în schimbarea sistemului economic și politic din Peru, folosind din nou țăranii din Peru. Majoritatea covârșitoare a cetățenilor sau locuitorilor din Peru la vremea aceea, în anii 60, erau oameni care trăiau în sărăcie, erau oameni săraci, erau oameni care puteau fi ușor radicalizați, să li se spună că printr-o revoluție a lor pot schimba lucrurile peste noapte, dacă vor lua armele și vor lupta la nivel militar, la nivel de terorism împotriva autorităților. A ajuns profesor universitar la Universitatea din Ayacucho, unde a predat dreptul și filozofia. Guzman a început să propovăduiască radicalismul politic, a început să propovăduiască necesitatea terorismului și acțiunilor armate împotriva autorităților. A format la vremea aceea această organizație care se numește Shining Path, Calea Luminoasă, și a început să recruteze alți profesori universitari la doctrina maoistă a comunismului, de asemenea o mulțime de studenți și de asemenea o mulțime de țărani și numiți campesinos, oameni săraci care locuiau în orașul Ayacucho și în împrejurimile orașului Ayacucho. Personal am vizitat orașul Ayacucho când am fost în Peru și am văzut cu ochii mei sărăcia care încă se află în acel oraș din Munții Anzi. Vă recomand să vizitați și dumneavoastră. Going back to English, Professor Serna, you mentioned Ayacucho a couple of times, and if you can tell us, of course, the subject is vast. I mean, I love Peru. I mentioned that at the beginning before we actually went online. And I'm trying to sell Peru to the Europeans, to the Romanians. And I just told them to go to Arequipa, a fascinating place in Peru. So tell us a little bit about Ayacucho and the historical aspect of Ayacucho before we get into the events dealing with Guzman and the terrorists, the years of terror.
Yeah, Ayacucho occupies a very unique place in Peruvian history because in addition to being the location where the most violence took place during the Shining Path years, it is also the cradle of Peruvian independence. And the final battle of independence took place, La Batalla de Ayacucho, that the Battle of Ayacucho that took place in Ayacucho, and that was where really the Spanish viceroyalty finally capitulated and Peru gained its independence. So it has this long legacy of being a place where history happens, and particularly where revolutionary political history takes place. And so in the 20th century, it becomes a kind of place where it's the cradle for a different type of movement, and this one is for the movement that ends up becoming the Shining Path. Now, Ayacucho is in addition to all these things, it's kind of a place with almost a literary kind of occupation in Peruvian psyche, because in Quechua, the language that is spoken by the indigenous people who live in Ayacucho, the word Ayacucho means the corner of the dead. And so that makes Ayacucho kind of almost seem to be an apt title for this place that would occupy so much kind of the Peruvian imagination as a place where political violence has taken place historically. But it's also a place with strong history of peasant mobilization, peasants engaging in mobilization for land, for sure, but also for education. They mobilized against the military dictatorship that tried to do away with free college tuition for public universities. And so they had a history of mobilization as well, and for kind of really engaging the Peruvian state at times when the indigenous peasantry there felt that their grievances were not being addressed. And so it was a place with a strong political history, with many active political parties, as several historians have noted. And so even when the university, which was a colonial university, it closed down for much of the 19th century and early 20th century, when it reopened in the mid 20th century, it too became a real kind of intellectual incubator where you would have poets and artists and kind of leftist intellectuals all getting together as using the space to really engage in deep political and artistic thought. And that was the scene that Armando Guzman arrives to in 1962, when he ends up becoming the newest member of the faculty there.
Thank you very much. When we come back, I would like for you to tell us a little bit about Guzman and his view of religion. A lot of the people that follow me on my Facebook page are Christians, practicing Christians, most of them conservative Christians. And when we come back, I would like for you to let us know, I am personally interested, having fled Romania on account of religious persecution. And I think that a lot of people would be interested to know what Guzman's view of religion and the role of religion in oppressing or liberating people was. If you don't mind, when we come back, let me switch to Romania and make a brief presentation of Ayacucho, and I'll be right back. Întrebarea pe care am pus-o domnului profesor privește exact localitatea aceasta, Ayacucho, parcă este ca un oraș mitic aflat undeva în vârful munților Anzi. Cum spuneam, am vizitat Ayacucho, are o mulțime de catedrale și biserici și pentru a înțelege discuția din seara aceasta, e important să știm câteva cuvinte despre Ayacucho, locul în care a izbucnit această mișcare teroristă. Ayacucho a fost locul în care în anul, mi se pare, 1822, 21, 23, cam așa ceva, deci cu aproximativ 200 de ani în urmă, a avut loc poate ultima bătălie dintre spanioli, armata spaniolă și peruvieni, populația armată din America Latină, pentru independența Americii Latine. După cum poate vă amintiți, au fost doi mari conducători ai Revoluției pentru independență împotriva Spaniei în America Latină. Unul a fost Simon Bolivar, iar altul a fost, am uitat cum îi spune, cineva din Argentina, am uitat numele persoanei, dar ultima bătălie care s-a purtat pentru independența Americii Latine și a țării Peru, de fapt, a fost în Ayacucho. Am fost personal la locația aceea pe câmpul de bătălie și, într-adevăr, Ayacucho poartă, cum ar fi Plevna pentru români, poartă o semnificație deosebită pentru populația din Peru, pentru intelectualii din Peru, și acolo au existat aproape în permanență mișcări răscoale, mișcări de rebeliune împotriva autorităților, curente ideologice diferite, poate unele stranii, și de fapt ne spunea că numele de Ayacucho în limba nativă a persoanelor native incași este Corner of the Dead, adică colțul morții, cum ar fi în limba română. And by the way, Professor La Serna, there is another Ayacucho in South America, in Venezuela, right? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that because I want to get there one day as well, but not right now. So going back to our question about Guzman and religion, faith, Catholicism, what details can you give us?
So Armel Guzman, when he was teaching at the university, he would sometimes walk into the classroom and he would write on those chalkboard, "Does God exist?" And then he would just pose the question and let his students debate it. Now, in the 1960s and even into the 70s, most students at the university were Catholic, so you can imagine what kind of conversation this generated. People were saying, of course God is real, of course God exists, and they would talk about it, and he would let them talk, and then he would, after a while, after they debated it, he would cut them off, and he would say, "No, God does not exist. Religion is the opiate of the masses." And so he definitely subscribed to this kind of doctrine and mantra that is typical among communism about religion not being something that is actually worth studying in a kind of communist kind of reality. And however, the Shining Path itself, in some ways, became a substitute for religion, because and others have argued, like the anthropologist Carlos Iván de Gregori, who the late anthropologist of Peru, that in some ways there was a kind of religious, the Shining Path itself became almost a religious kind of cult, as some have argued. And the argument there is that Guzman then became almost the new messianic leader. So instead of the figure of the Christ, for example, it was Guzman who, with his war name of Presidente Gonzalo, or Chairman Gonzalo, which ended up becoming his name by the end of the war, that figure that he created for himself, that persona, would end up becoming the messianic figure who would actually bring Peru to this kind of communist dreamland, really, or promised land. And so in many ways, that the devotion that some people performed for the Shining Path as having this almost biblical truth to some of its teachings, and some of the teachings that Guzman's actually spread, which was his interpretation and also his actual synopsis of Maoism, that became in some ways for some a replacement of biblical truths, and it became kind of a new kind of religion. I've actually started to push back against this narrative of the Shining Path, which is the prevailing one, and I don't think that necessarily people bought into this with this kind of religious fervor, as has been suggested otherwise. But certainly there was there's no question that this was what the objective was, and this was what Guzman and the other leadership really wanted to harness, this kind of almost religious devotion to him as their messianic leader, and to the Shining Path almost as in communism as the new God.
Thank you. Let me again make a brief synopsis of your comments in Romanian, and then we'll get back. And I would like, when I return, I would like for us to start talking about what I call the years of terror, 1980 to 1992, what happened, and so on and so forth. Deci l-am întrebat pe domnul profesor să ne spună care au fost pozițiile intelectuale, ideologice ale lui Guzman privind religia. Natural, cei care sunteți în categoria mea de vârstă, noi am supraviețuit comunismul și chiar cei mai tineri ați trăit sub comunism și știți că am avut mult de suferit din cauza credinței noastre creștine sub un guvern și autorități comuniste. L-am întrebat deci care au fost pozițiile acestui terorist Guzman în Peru privind religia, creștinismul, catolicismul, și dânsul mi-a dat următoarele detalii. Fiind profesor universitar, Guzman punea întrebări retorice de genul: există Dumnezeu? Deci mergea în sala de clasă și scria pe tablă cu creta: există Dumnezeu, și încerca să aducă în discuție subiectul. Natural, 100% sau aproape 100% din studenții pe care îi avea erau catolici, creștini, care proveneau dintr-o familie catolică, un mediu creștin, și asta stârnea conversații între profesori și între studenți. Studenții, natural, credeau că există Dumnezeu, dar Guzman le spunea în final: nu există Dumnezeu, religia, așa cum spunea Marx, este opiu pentru popor, o formă de subjugare și de exploatare, o unealtă de exploatare a omului de către om. În timp, spune domnul profesor, domnul Guzman a transformat într-un fel mișcarea aceasta teroristă pe care a făcut-o, Shining Path, Sendero Luminoso, într-un fel de cult, într-un fel de cult religios, în care credința era în revoluție, în viitor, în comunism, iar un fel de mesia era această persoană, Guzman, care a creat pe lângă el un cult al personalității, fiind cărora pe care oamenii într-un sens îl adorau. Deci, într-un sens, religia creștină, catolicismul, au fost înlocuite în această mișcare de credința în comunism și de credința în acest lider crud, așa după cum veți vedea în următoarele minute sau câteva minute, privind modul în care el s-a comportat. Deci, cum vedem, în America Latină, Guzman promova aceleași noțiuni privind comunismul care erau promovate și în România. Nu există Dumnezeu, natural, Guzman era ateu, și vedem foarte bine cum, la fel ca și Stalin, acești oameni fără Dumnezeu au creat și au ucis, au creat niște atrocități fără greu de exprimat în cuvinte, care au dus la uciderea a milioane și milioane de oameni. O mică paranteză: cei care încă nu știți, nu cunoașteți, în 100 de ani de comunism, între 1917 și 2017, deci în 100 de ani de comunism, Revoluția bolșevică, până în 2017, comuniștii au ucis în mod intenționat, prin diferite acțiuni, 100 de milioane de ființe umane. Asta înseamnă 1 milion de oameni pe an. So going back to Professor Guzman, let's talk about what I call the years of terror. We are, I think, in 1980 now, and the armed actions by Guzman and his associates break out in Ayacucho or in that area, and take us from there, please.
Yeah, so in 1980, the Shining Path decides to launch its armed insurgency after building up the party really for the past decade. And mostly doing this in a clandestine kind of format. They had driven the party underground for the second half of the 70s, and Guzman he went into hiding, and nobody knew his whereabouts, actually. The Shining Path launches its insurgency in 1980, notwithstanding the fact that the Peruvian military is actually withdrawing from kind of the power of the government, and they're returning to democratic elections. But the Shining Path and Guzman believed that this was all a kind of a way to conceal and the fascism that was still kind of continuing to run the country, even with the military retreating back to the barracks. But also that they believe that this was just a move to placate the masses, because to kind of stall the revolutionary momentum that was already starting to take hold among groups like the Shining Path. And so they rejected the return to democracy and chose the night before the first national elections after 12 years of military rule as the night to launch their insurgency. So the very, very intentional choice of what date to do this. This was on May 17th, 1980, when the Shining Path launches its insurgency. The next day was going to be the national election. Their very first armed action in Ayacucho, in a peasant village there, is to burn the ballot boxes in a village called Chushchi. And they did this as a kind of symbolic rejection of the what they saw as a sham democracy that was being experimented with and put into place. And then from there on, they started carrying out actions that were were largely popular because Shining Path would send cadres into indigenous peasant villages, and they would actually bring to justice what they, through what they call these popular trials, they called them, people who were bad actors at the local level, abusive landlords, corrupt officials like mayors and lieutenant governors. But also people who were like cattle rustlers, people who were known womanizers. And so these are the people that the Shining Path would round up in these kind of ad hoc trials that they did right there in the village squares, and they would bring them to justice. And oftentimes this meant probably humiliating them publicly, perhaps stripping them naked, parading them around the square, much in a kind of performative justice, similar to what we would see during Mao's Cultural Revolution. But they didn't necessarily kill these people at first, within the first year. Then we start to see by the end of the first year, by the end of 1980, the Shining Path starts actually executing some of these bad actors as part of their punishments. This still doesn't necessarily result in a widespread loss of peasant support, because these are people who had also a long track record of abuse at the local level. But then once these actors are either killed or threatened or kind of expelled from communities, the Shining Path, because of Guzman's own blood quota, which is how he termed it, he demanded a blood quota in order to actually achieve the kind of communist reality. And he actually said that it was necessary to cross a river of blood in order to get to the other side of the communist utopia. And so he demanded more and more blood. And so after the people that many villagers believe were needed to be brought to justice were no longer kind of in the picture, the Shining Path starts to turn toward wealthier peasants, toward authorities who didn't have a bad reputation, and so they started killing them also, particularly by 1982. And so in 1983, some peasants decided to form their own counter-insurgency militias to fight the Shining Path. And they did this right there in Ayacucho, sometimes working with the armed forces, but sometimes working completely independently as a rejection against the extreme violence that the Shining Path was imposing. This alters the war, turning it truly into a civil war, where you have civilians fighting against civilians, and armed civilians fighting against other armed civilians, not to mention the state that comes in with its reaction. And it's a very reactionary state that engages in state terror, mass disappearances, torture, and massacres, as the Shining Path is doing these same types of things. This really escalates the violence, and it gets to a situation where, when all is said and done, nearly 70,000 Peruvians were killed as a result of this war, and they from both the state forces as well as the Shining Path forces, and as well as other kind of forces like the peasant militias. And so most of the victims were Quechua-speaking peasants in places like Ayacucho, and it became a very complex situation. And that's kind of the rise of the Shining Path. And then I don't know if you'd like me to go into the fall also and the capture, or save that for another question.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Maybe you should segment out. You are providing a lot of very useful information and data, which I would like to convey to our public, to our viewers tonight. I know that your time is limited. Please do not hesitate to send me a text message, or tell me even, now in our conversation, that you only have 5 minutes left, and we will bring our conversation to a close. But again, I appreciate, and people in the comment section are appreciating you being with me tonight. Switching to Romanian, then back to English. And again, don't be bashful. Let me know that you only have 5-10 minutes left, and we'll honor your request. Deci, revoluția aceasta teroristă a început în anul 1980 în orașul acesta, Ayacucho, pe data de 17 mai anul 1980. Pe data de 18 mai 1980 urmau să aibă alegeri în Peru. Înainte de 1980, în Peru a fost un guvern militar, vreme de aproximativ 10 ani. Cei care sunteți aproape de vârsta mea, poate vă amintiți, în publicațiile din România, în Scânteia, de exemplu, se vorbea foarte mult despre guvernul militar al lui Hugo Banzer din Peru, care a decis în mai 1980 să aibă alegeri libere, să tranziționeze înspre democrație, dar teroristul Guzman și mișcarea lui, Sendero Luminoso, au decis că aceste alegeri de fapt vor întârzia Revoluția comunistă, vor fi alegeri false și cu o zi înainte de începerea de alegeri, pe 17 mai 1980, au lansat primul atac terorist în orașul Ayacucho. Au distrus câteva clădiri, au interzis sau au prevenit oamenii pentru a merge la alegeri, pentru a vota, au distrus buletinele de vot, iar după aceea, la scurt timp după aceea, revoluția aceasta comunistă, teroristă, pur și simplu s-a extins în tot Peru, începând din Munții Anzi și cu populația nativă incașă. Printre altele, detalii sunt enorme, nu putem intra în aceste detalii în seara aceasta, dar detaliile privind cruzimea și atrocitățile făcute de această mișcare teroristă sunt absolut neimaginabile. Vă încurajez să studiați și voi în mod personal când aveți timp despre această mișcare. Un lucru pe care l-a menționat domnul profesor la Serna sunt aceste tribunale populare. Poate țineți minte că pe vremea comunismului erau în România tribunalele populare unde anumite persoane erau date în judecată și erau date în judecată, dar nu erau judecători sau persoane pregătite în drept și în lege pentru a ține aceste procese. La fel și în zonele ocupate de teroriștii din Peru, al lui Guzman, au avut aceste tribunale populare ținute în spațiul public. Pur și simplu scoteau primarii din primării, scoteau funcționarii publici din clădirile publice în satele din Munții Anzi, îi puneau cu spatele la perete, îi acuzau de tot felul de abuzuri în oficiu și îi împușcau. De asemenea, scoteau bețivii de pe străzi, prostituatele, prostituații, întreaga rețea administrativă dintr-o localitate, îi dezbrăcau de haine, îi puneau să alerge goi, pușcă prin străzi și după aceea îi ucideau. După aceea au început să intre și în orașe. Erau atât de vicioși încât Guzman a impus ceea ce domnul profesor a numit blood quotas, adică cote de sânge, adică în fiecare zi sau într-o perioadă specifică de timp, fiecare terorist din această mișcare teroristă avea obligația să ucidă un număr anumit de persoane. La început, după cum spuneam, dacă la început se profilau pe autorități, cum ar fi primari, cum ar fi funcționari publici, după aceea au început să execute și persoanele care dețineau pământ, latifundiari, iar după aceea au început să ucidă și să dea în aceste tribunale publice și țăranii care aveau nițică pământ, cum erau în România chiaburi în anii 40 și 50 în vremea comunismului, pur și simplu îi ucideau. De la o vreme, acești țărani, ca să-și apere proprietatea, să-și apere familiile și pământul, au început să formeze ei grupuri militare care să contracareze aceste bande de teroriști ale lui Guzman. Și, cum spunea domnul profesor, s-a produs de fapt un război civil, un mini-război civil în inima țării Peru, în Munții Anzi, care s-a terminat doar în anul 1992 și ca urmare a acestui război au murit numai puțin de aproximativ 69 până la 70.000 de persoane în 12 ani. Asta înseamnă aproximativ 5.000 de persoane care au fost ucise în fiecare an prin măsurile acestea extreme, extremiste, teroriste, deosebit de pline de cruzime. Professor La Serna, we can now, if you don't mind, touching a little bit on the government's reaction to these terroristic attacks. I understand that the government also and the government forces also were not entirely clean, and their hands also have blood on their hands. And tell us what the government did, and then how Mr. Guzman was captured, and so on and so forth?
During the first months of the insurgency, the government, which was led by the President Belaunde, really kind of dismissed the rebels. In fact, Belaunde famously said they were just kind of a ragtag group of cattle rustlers, and they didn't need to be taken seriously. But by the end of the first year of actions, the Shining Path really couldn't be ignored any longer. It became clear that they were starting to make incredible inroads with some of the peasantry. That they were actually carrying out some pretty impressive strikes against police targets. They eventually would end up doing things like pretty daring jailbreaks that captured the imagination. And so by 1982 and the end of 1982 and early 1983, the president decides actually to send in the Navy into the highlands to try to engage in a war of counterterrorism. And this is kind of a conundrum to see why the Navy would be used in a place where there is no water up in the middle of the Andes Mountains. But they were sent in with the express kind of purpose of crushing not just the Shining Path, but anybody who lent support, moral or otherwise, to the Shining Path. This ended up escalating the violence where indigenous peasants found themselves in many cases kind of on the one hand trying to deal with the Shining Path and concerned about the violence that the Shining Path was carried out, but on the other hand, they were also worried about the forces of the military doing raids on villages, burning villages to the ground, doing mass executions of indigenous peasants, and turning their own military base into a detention center. It was a place just outside of Huamanga, in the capital of Ayacucho. This place, Los Cabitos, ended up becoming a massive kind of detention center where people would go in on suspicion of being engaged with the Shining Path and very little actual legal evidence, and in many cases they never came out. It was discovered later that the people who died under interrogation or were killed because there was not enough evidence to try them in a court, that they ended up being put in a actual cremation oven and burned to kind of dispose of their bodies in a scene that was all too familiar for many people, people familiar with Nazi Germany. And so this was something that was a horrible legacy of the Shining Path years, in that the Shining Path engaged in its kind of campaign of terror, but the state reacted with its own campaign of terror. And so detention, the kind of suspension of any kind of rights to due process was common. There was curfews enacted, and there was martial law basically declared in much of the war zones. And so this was kind of the way that the war played out through much of the 1980s, which in some ways only contributed to Shining Path's lasting impact, because people saw the reaction of the government, of the military and the police in particular, and thought that, well, maybe now there's something to be fighting against. But the Shining Path continued to do its own kind of campaign of destruction and terror and human rights violations, and that ended up making it to where it was a very, very it was a humanitarian and human rights crisis that was developing quickly. So in 1990, Peruvians tried to move into a different direction by electing a neophyte, a political outsider, Alberto Fujimori, who was the rector of the Agrarian University in Lima, as a sort of an outsider to kind of try to change course. But Fujimori ended up becoming a dictator in his own right. He actually suspended the Congress. He declared a self-coup, basically to give himself dictatorial powers. And then in doing so, he continued to suspend many civil liberties in the country. He claimed, of course, to be doing this in the name of fighting terrorism. as it would happen, that it was during this period of martial law and kind of the early years of an autocratic regime that Guzman ended up being captured. But we now know that he was captured not because of the suspension of these rights and liberties and because of the extreme human rights abuses that were happening at the time, but rather because of kind of good old-fashioned police work on the one hand, where police, so there was a unit within the Peruvian police force that was tasked with hunting down the main leaders of the Shining Path, and they did so not by kind of coming in, kicking in doors and torturing people into confessions, but they did so by just doing detective work, building paper trails, learning the ways of the Shining Path, studying their documents. And this ended up leading them to trace very kind of different circles of leadership and ultimately capturing Guzman and his second wife, Elena Iparraguirre, in 1992. And they all along, it turned out that they were not in the Andes or in the jungle fighting somewhere, but they were sitting in a pretty comfortable, safe house in a suburban Lima neighborhood.
What was the name of that neighborhood in Lima?
Of the what?
What was the name of the neighborhood in Lima where they lived?
It was, I can actually write it in the chat here.
Okay. I thought it was Miraflores. Of course, I must be wrong about that, but
they were in Miraflores at some point, but that's not where they were captured.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Switching back to and by the way, I want to ask you a brief question. I saw the movie Dancer Upstairs. I don't know if you know about that movie. Maybe you have seen it. Is that a movie which depicts the capture or the events leading up to the capture of Abiela Guzman?
The Dancer Upstairs is a John Malkovich movie that
Right.
is an adaptation of the Nicholas Shakespeare novel, which actually is a fictionalized account of the capture of Guzman, but it is loosely based on the actual capture of Guzman, highly fictionalized and romanticized, but also based on the notion that Guzman was hiding out in a kind of suburban neighborhood, and that he was actually living in the house of a dance instructor who actually instructed a woman who was a dance instructor and a dancer herself, who actually sometimes instructed little children of rich Peruvian kids. And so this kind of incredible drama of it all was ended up being kind of fictionalized in this account of the Dancer Upstairs, but all the figures, the characters have been changed, the names have been changed, and even the name of the country, I think, it's not called Peru. It's some kind of fictionalized Latin American country.
Ok, thank you. Domnul profesor m-a atenționat în privat că am făcut o eroare în ceea ce am comunicat și vreau să clarific ceea ce am comunicat. Am menționat mai devreme că în anii 70 Peru era sub autoritatea militară a generalului Hugo Banzer, însă m-a atenționat că de fapt Hugo Banzer era în Bolivia. Am făcut greșeala aceasta pentru că am fost în Bolivia acum câțiva ani și m-am întâlnit cu creștini în Bolivia, cum e obiceiul meu când călătoresc în țările din America Latină să mă întâlnesc cu creștini, și m-am întâlnit cu o persoană care era un funcționar în administrația generalului Banzer și mi-a explicat modul în care teroriștii în Bolivia au fost anihilați de acest general. În Peru, la vremea aceea, generalul sau președintele era președintele Velázquez, pentru a înțelege în mod corect seria evenimentelor politice din Peru. Deci întrebarea pe care am pus-o domnului profesor a fost, ne-a explicat pe de o parte atrocitățile care au fost comise de teroriști. L-am rugat să ne spună cum au reacționat autoritățile la aceste atrocități. La început, spune domnul profesor, reacția armatei sau reacția administrației peruviene a fost una mai blândă. Ei credeau că acești teroriști erau de fapt niște hoți de vite, cum spunea domnul profesor, dar după un an, 2-3 ani și-au dat seama că au de a face cu o mișcare într-adevăr teroristă care intenționa să apuce puterea în Peru și să instaureze comunismul de tip maoist. Ca atare au început președinții următori să lanseze acțiuni militare împotriva teroriștilor, au ucis o mulțime de teroriști, dar din nefericire au început să persecute și populația locală, mai ales populația incașă din Munții Anzi, care era mai înclinată să se asocieze cu mișcarea teroristă a lui Guzman. Guvernul a instalat câteva centre de detenție în Munții Anzi, unde au luat pur și simplu oameni suspectați de a avea relații cu teroriștii, i-au pus în acele centre de detenție, pe foarte mulți i-au torturat, mulți au murit fiind torturați. S-au descoperit de asemenea în Peru aceste morminte uriașe comune în care au fost îngropați atât teroriști care au fost omorâți, cât și civili care au fost uciși de către forțele armate pentru că erau suspectați de terorism. Ajungem în anul 1990, când un nou președinte ajunge la putere în Peru, președintele Fujimori, și în anul 1992 este capturat domnul Guzman în Lima, care este capitala țării Peru. Și în final, spune domnul profesor, Guzman a fost capturat nu printr-o mișcare sau printr-o acțiune armată deosebită, ci doar prin bunul simț și dexteritatea unor polițiști care au perseverat și vreme de mulți ani au fost pe urmele lui Guzman, au început să-i detecteze mișcările și de fapt să-i și prevadă, să pronosticheze locurile pe unde Guzman va ajunge și ca atare într-o bună zi l-au prins, l-au capturat împreună cu soția lui într-un cartier din Lima, un cartier de fapt al bogaților. L-am întrebat în final pe domnul profesor să ne spună câteva cuvinte despre filmul acesta care se numește Dancer Upstairs. Vreau să fac aici o mică paranteză, cei care sunteți interesați de subiectul în seara aceasta, puteți urmări un film al cărui titlu în engleză este Dancer Upstairs. A fost făcut de un director sârb care într-o direcție care indirect de fapt discută viața și captarea, prinderea, capturarea lui Guzman de către autorități. Ne apropiem de final, vom discuta în următoarea întrebare, care am sau segment pentru domnul profesor, viața în închisoare, ce s-a întâmplat cu Guzman, ce s-a întâmplat în Peru după ce Guzman a fost capturat, pus în închisoare și decesul lui Guzman. So, Professor, I thank you very much for your patience. Moving right along, let's talk about. We talked about Guzman being caught. I understand he was put on trial in jail. Eventually, eventually he died in September of last year. What details can you give us?
Yeah, Guzman ended up being sentenced to life in prison. He was originally brought in and tried with with a military tribunal of hooded judges, and that ended up being declared once Peru ended up rejoining the sort of the Inter-American court as an unfair trial, as though he was retried later with due process and resentenced to life in prison. He ended up basically from 1992 up until last year being in prison, and he was in conditions of total isolation, and he was put at a naval prison base. So he was not able to receive visitors from anybody other than his attorney and his immediate family. But in this case, his immediate family was his wife, who was also the number 2 in the Shining Path hierarchy, and she was also in prison at a maximum security prison on the other side of the city, and later in a place called Ancon, which I could also write in the chat. And she was able to visit him, I think, once a year or maybe twice a year, but with very restricted conditions. And so that was the conditions that he ended up being in. He dedicated himself to reading. He was an avid reader all his life, and he read everything, including my co-author and I discovered shortly after his death that one of the last books that he read was our book that had been translated into Spanish. And so he was an avid reader. And he read far and wide, and he dedicated himself also to writing a memoir of his early war, kind of early party building years, not really the war years. He ends this kind of tome that he wrote really at the rise of the Shining Path insurgency. And I think he may have been planning to even write a second installment, but that ended up never getting published. So I'm not sure if it was in the works or not. But because he's convicted of terrorism, he's not legally allowed to make any publications. And so these were banned in Peru, and they were not allowed to circulate legally there. And so this was kind of the conditions that he was in, and his death has really caused a renewed conversation about the Shining Path, about the war years, and about the open wounds of the country that many of them still haven't been healed.
Thank you very much. Going back to Romanian, and then when I come back, I would like for you, hopefully the final segment of our conversation, if you can tell us a few things about the, I understand that a Truth and Reconciliation Commission has been drawn up in Peru, which sort of try to uncover the truth about these terrible, terrible years in Peruvian society, and hopefully we can end up on a positive note, this otherwise difficult subject. Deci, Guzman a fost prins, capturat în 1992, a fost pus în închisoare natural și după aceea a fost dat în judecată. A fost găsit vinovat de terorism și a fost condamnat la închisoare pe restul vieții, pe lifetime, adică pe parcursul vieții, pe toată viața. El a făcut un recurs după aceea la Curtea Interamericană a Drepturilor Omului, prezințând că tribunalul din Peru nu i-a făcut dreptate. Apropo, judecătorii care l-au judecat pe domnul Guzman erau acoperiți la față, aveau măștini acelea trase pe față pentru a nu putea fi identificați. Deci domnul Guzman a făcut recurs la sentința care a fost dată în Peru, dar din nefericire pentru el, la nivel de Curtea Interamericană a Drepturilor Omului a pierdut, așa că din 1992 până în 2021, în septembrie, Guzman a rămas în închisoare, a fost ținut în izolație tot timpul acesta. Singura persoană care putea să o vadă a fost soția lui, dar având în vedere că soția dânsului era persoana numărul 2 în conducerea acestei organizații teroriste și ea a primit o sentință de încarcerare, închisoare pe toată viața, așa că cei doi se vedeau din când în când. El a fost pus în închisoare la o bază militară din Lima, aproape de Lima, și soția dânsului a fost pusă în altă închisoare, într-un centru de detenție la cealaltă parte, extremitate a metropolei Lima. Cum și-a petrecut domnul Guzman restul vieții, pur și simplu citea. De fapt, ne spunea oaspetele nostru din seara aceasta că una din ultimele cărți pe care Guzman le-a citit a fost cartea pe care oaspetele meu din seara aceasta a publicat-o acum câțiva ani și care din nou se numește The Shining Path, Love, Madness and Revolution in the Andes, Calea Luminoasă, dragoste, nebunie și revoluție în Munții Anzi. Poate vă amintiți, dragi prieteni, că acum vreo 2-3 ani, când a fost publicată cartea aceasta, am făcut o mini-recenzie a cărții pe pagina mea de Facebook și, din nou, caut să vă informez privind subiecte importante și relevante care ne ajută să înțelegem cursul istoriei și să evităm lucrurile neplăcute din trecut. Întrebarea și subiectul final care îl am pentru oaspetele meu în seara aceasta are de a face cu o comisie pentru adevăr și reconciliere care cumva a încercat să pună punct acestui capitol dificil din istoria acestei țări, Peru. Decesul, moartea în închisoare a lui Guzman în septembrie 2021 a cauzat renașterea unei dezbateri naționale privind rolul acestui om în istoria recentă a țării Peru. Încă la ora actuală, Guzman are mulți fani, mulți suporteri în Peru, în mod special în cercurile de stânga, cercurile intelectuale idealiste, dar majoritatea celor din Peru își amintesc încă de anii dictaturii și de anii terorismului și nu vor să mai audă nimic privind acest caracter atât de nefast și crud din istoria recentă din Peru. Professor, as I said a short while ago, let's see if you can wrap up this conversation by discussing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I spent 1989 in South Africa. I thought I was a college professor like you are today. And by the way, I admire people like you. You have time to think. I'm also envious. I studied diplomacy, Sovietology. In 1989 put an end to my area of expertise. The Soviet Union collapsed. So I became a lawyer. But I remember in South Africa, 1989 and thereafter, when the apartheid system ended, the South Africans put together this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so when I read in your piece that you published in the fall of last year, great, by the way, about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Peru, I said I must ask my guest tonight about this attempt to reconcile both sides. Admirable. So what can you tell us about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and how it worked and what it accomplished, if anything?
Yeah, no. So after Guzman was captured, the political violence continued in different forms. The Shining Path, actually, there was a kind of a band of it that continued to be operational even after his capture in 1992. And Fujimori was actually elected to a third term, because only by a maneuvering where he was able to kind of change the constitution to his favor to allow him to do this, and he was reelected in a very, very contested election that many believe was fraudulent, and many more believe was unconstitutional. But he did take his third term, and then shortly after being elected, this is going into 2000. There was he became enveloped in a wide bribery scandal where Fujimori's regime was seen to be to bribing everybody from media heads to army leaders to just really anybody, kind of being able to try to give favorable coverage and responses to the government. And so after the scandal broke, Fujimori ended up eventually fleeing the country and resigning via fax from his parental motherland or homeland of Japan. That was his parents' ancestral home, and so he was granted asylum there. And so in the interim, Peru had to kind of grapple with this recent history and this history of corruption, this history of political violence, and this legacy of real bloodshed that they had yet to grapple with. And so during this period of an interim government after Fujimori's abrupt departure, there was a real grassroots mobilization for human rights and for the truth and for reconciliation. And this wellspring of support that brought in sectors from all across Peruvian society demanded real reconciliation with this recent past. And so this resulted in the interim government establishing what would end up being called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the CVR by its acronym in Spanish, to investigate the violence and really understand who the perpetrators were and who the victims and survivors were. And it was a very, very, very ambitious project. It was a very robust team, bringing in scholars, bringing in clerics, bringing in some members of the military and lawyers and attorneys to try to understand and learn. And they did model in some ways off of the South African Truth Commission example, but they also tried to go beyond the South African model by actually really focusing on the reconciliation part. So not just finding out what happened, but who was responsible and who should be held accountable. And that was a dramatic departure from previous truth commissions that had happened before this in South Africa, and even in places like Argentina, which had limitations in terms of the way that they were able to address the accountability question. And so the Truth Commission ended up collecting some 17,000 testimonies. They ended up writing a 9-volume, 10,000-page long report that was very exhaustive and really got at the true kind of scale of the violence. Whereas before, it was estimated that the amount of deaths were in the low 10,000s. We found out that it was almost 70,000. We found out that many of the victims overwhelmingly were indigenous people, Quechua speakers in places like Ayacucho. And so this was a moment to really start to kind of address reconciliation. And so as my colleague Jo Marie Burt has discussed elsewhere, it was a moment of true hope where justice could actually be part of the process of healing. And some members of the Peruvian military and the officials, like eventually Fujimori himself, were actually brought to trial. Some of them were convicted, including Fujimori, who was just released, by the way, on pardon within the last 48 hours. So that's a saga that still continues to this day. But there was a real hope, and as my colleague Jo Marie Burt describes, this was a lost hope, because after this interim government, then you have one of the governments that was in power during the kind of the worst of the state violence was came back into power, and that was Alan Garcia. And so his government, he became the president again after a long hiatus. And so once that happened, the move for restorative justice became really, really handicapped, and it struggled, and it's continued to struggle really to this day. So justice has been incredibly frustrated. It's been incredibly incomplete. And so as long as that tends to be the case, and as long as there's cases, like as I said, we're just learning about with Fujimori's kind of recent pardon, which we don't know is going to stay or not. There is a real sense in Peru that true reconciliation and true healing can never really be fully realized.
Yes, thank you. Let me switch back to Romanian, and when we come back, I have something else came to mind. If you can maybe recommend some books or maybe movies on the topic that we discussed tonight, I would like to recommend to the public in Romania and whoever is going to watch this show. And so, from what I understand, work has not been finished in Peru with respect to this issue, and probably it never will end. It's going to be a work in progress. Brief parentheses: we are facing, or we should have, I should say, we have faced something similar in Romania after 1989, 1990, 50 years of communism. Even to this day, I don't think that Romanians have gotten to the bottom of the full story and implications and dimensions of communism. The same old story. Who killed JR? So that's sort of the end point. So let me go back and present a brief synopsis in Romanian, and then of your last comments. And then if you can recommend a couple of books, maybe in English, Spanish even, and movies, will close. Deci l-am întrebat pe domnul profesor să ne spună cum s-a terminat acest capitol în istoria recentă a țării Peru. Dânsul mi-a explicat că încă la ora actuală acest capitol nu s-a încheiat și probabil că nu se va încheia niciodată, pentru că încă se încearcă aflarea adevărului privind acești antriști în istoria țării. Îi spuneam domnului profesor în limba engleză, la fel ca și în România, unde încă încercăm să aflăm ce s-a petrecut de fapt de vremea comunismului, în cei 45-50 de ani de comunism, și încă muncim la proiectul acesta. Deci în anul 2000, președintele Fujimori a fugit din Peru, fiind acuzat de corupție, s-a dus în Japonia, unde a primit azil politic și a fost ales un nou președinte, care a instaurat o comisie a adevărului și a reconcilierii la nivel național cu diferite obiective. În primul rând să afle adevărul privind antiterorismului în Peru și în al doilea rând să se afle persoanele care ar fi fost responsabile pentru aceste acte pline de cruzime și numărul 3, să se ajungă la o reconciliere națională privind evenimentele acestea. Această comisie a funcționat vreme de mai mulți ani. Îmi spunea domnul profesor și n-am știut până acum, au fost audiate aproximativ 17.000 de persoane și s-a alcătuit un raport final care conține 19.000 de pagini, un raport național care conține 19.000 de pagini privind violența anilor 1980 până în 1992. În final, l-am rugat pe domnul profesor să ne dea câteva titluri de cărți sau filme pe care le-am putea citi sau urmări cei care suntem interesați în acest subiect. I have a question for you, Professor Serna. Is this report available online? Is it available in English? 19,000 pages, that's a lot of reading to do.
It's a lot of reading, and it is available online. So I think it's cvr.org/Peru or PE, if I'm not mistaken. But if you just look up Truth and Reconciliation Commission Peru, you can find a digital source where actually the entire report is available, and it is very sobering read, as you can imagine, but it's also incredibly informative, and something that also includes, I think, a photo gallery. So it's a pretty comprehensive website, and it's available in both Spanish and English. The Spanish side is more developed than the English side, but there is some in English if you're interested in doing this. But with respect to how you can learn more about this, aside from our book, which I appreciate you kind of advertising here, because it's really designed to be a narrative history for people who don't know about the history. So people, if you haven't really learned a lot about this story, then that's one that my colleague and I, Oren Stern and I, thought could be something that people can read just to learn about it without any background about the history. But there are really good specialized stories as well that are worth looking at. There's one by my colleague Jo Marie Burt, who I mentioned earlier, which is called, I think, Political Authoritarianism in Peru. I might be getting the title a little bit wrong, but it's something along that lines. And it really is about kind of authoritarianism of both Shining Path and the government during these years. It's a really incredible book. For the prehistory of Shining Path, I recommend Jamie Patricia Heilman. Her book is called Before the Shining Path, so it's an easy title to remember. And it's about Ayacucho and the kind of local politics that I had mentioned earlier, where there's a big kind of strong history of political action and engagement with the state before, in the many years before Shining Path took hold, is another excellent read. And then there's a classic volume edited by the historian Steve Stern called The Shining and Other Paths. And it is also brings together a number of perspectives on the war and its impact on Peruvian history and society. So I would start with those. There are also a couple of really good documentary films. One of them is called Peru, Time of Fear, and it's almost like a documentary companion to the Truth Commission website. It's a really beautifully and powerfully directed film that is a kind of a complete history of the war years, and it's really remarkable and powerful. And there's another one called The Fall of Fujimori, which is about Alberto Fujimori's rise and kind of dramatic fall, which is also kind of really a quite a gripping story. As far as fiction, you mentioned the Dancer Upstairs. That's one, but honestly, there have been some good literary fiction, but not as many good films. I think that the movie about the Shining Path, or the miniseries maybe, has yet to be written. And I think I would definitely look forward to any story that can try to capture the full depth of the history and the complexity of this story without sensationalizing, but at the same time capture its devastating impact. So that is a movie or a film series or miniseries that is that is just dying to be written.
Yes, I agree. Let me briefly state in Romanian what you just told me. Recommend the books and the documentaries, and then we'll end. L-am rugat pe domnul profesor în final să ne spună, să ne recomande câteva cărți privind subiectul din seara aceasta. O carte pe care și eu vi-o recomand pe baza informațiilor date nouă de profesor în limba engleză este cartea Political Authoritarianism in Peru, adică autoritarianismul politic în Peru. O altă carte este Before the Shining Path, un studiu destul de aprofundat a condițiilor care au dus la apariția acestei mișcări atât de extremiste politice și de asemenea încă o carte a unui autor american cu numele de Shining and Other Paths. Deci Calea Luminoasă și alte căi. L-am întrebat dacă sunt filme pe care le recomandă, care le-ați putea urmări privind atrocitățile din Peru în anii 80. Dânsul mi-a spus că încă nu cunoaște un film bun care să ne recomande, doar așa, cum spunea dânsul, fictions, adică nimic realistic privind evenimentele, dar totuși ne recomandă două documentare, materiale sau filme documentare, deci nu filme artistice. Primul este Peru, Time and Fear, deci Peru, timpul și teama, teroarea, iar al doilea...
Sorry, and it's actually, I misspoke, it's State of Fear.
State of Fear, ok.
Yeah, sorry.
Deci dânsul spune numele documentarului este Peru, timpul și starea de teamă, cum ar fi în limba română, iar al doilea documentar pe care recomandă este Fall of Fujimori, prăbușirea lui președintelui Fujimori, un documentar care și eu l-am văzut și pe care vi-l recomand. În final, dânsul spunea că acest raport de 19.000 de pagini este disponibil online. Îl puteți găsi dacă faceți Google, Truth and Reconciliation Peru. Există și o versiune în limba engleză a acestui raport și din nou vă recomand, dragi prieteni, să îl citiți dacă aveți timpul. În final vreau să mulțumesc oaspetelui meu și din nou vreau să pun în final în perspectivă subiectul din seara aceasta. Ne confruntăm în anul 2022 cu atentate la adresa democrației, a statului de drept. Știți că sunt un adept extraordinar și foarte convins al democrației, statului de drept și este important să evităm orice formă de extremism, mai ales pentru noi ca și creștini, inclusiv extremismul politic. Professor, it's been a fascinating evening. There is much more evening in Romania, of course daytime in the United States and in Texas, North Carolina. There is much more to talk about. You have really honored me. I feel honored by your presence on my Facebook page, and I say that with all humility and sincerity. And I do have a final question for you. Were you able to understand some of my Romanian?
More than I thought I would. You're right about the Latin kind of etymology made it to where I could follow along with some of it. I imagine that was the case for you in Peru too.
Yep. Yeah. Absolutely. Again, Professor, thank you very much. Have a nice afternoon, nice evening, and who knows, you might publish another book that might be of interest to us. And I hope you don't mind if I call you up again.
No, absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and to all of your listeners for paying attention to this subject. It's definitely an important one, and Peru definitely could use as much attention on the world stage as possible, because it's still dealing with the legacy of this, as well as with the impact of COVID-19 and other things. So thank you so much for really bringing attention to this country, and I hope that this can raise awareness about it.
And by the way, I'm ending here. I see lots of comments, like a cascade of comments coming in. Thank you, Professor. Felicitări means in Spanish probably would be felicidades or something like that.
Yeah. Felicidades, okay. Or felicitaciones. Yeah.
Felicitaciones. Okay. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Yes. Bye.